Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all watching this conference online today. Good afternoon, Mr. MacShane. We're very happy to welcome you today for the opening of this European Week dedicated to the place of Europe in the world. Could you please, Mr. MacShane, introduce yourself during a few minutes to the audience?
Yes, bonjour, salut, guten Tag, hello everybody, buonasera, buenos dias. I'm told, dzień dobry, that Yasu, I'm told I must speak in English, which I suppose is still just about a European language. It is driving my great friend Jean Quatremer, le doyen of all the correspondence in Brussels, who's been there for Libération for about 300 years, ever since the EU was founded. And he goes crazy anytime anybody speaks in English, especially if it's a French minister. But alas, English is the working language of Europe and still remains so. Me, well, lots of things I can say. I was present in 1981, on May the 10th, exactly 40 years ago, in the Place de la Bastille and Rue Solferino for the victory of François Mitterrand. That's how old I am. I've been interested in European politics all my life. I was a member of parliament in Britain for 18 years. I was the Minister for Europe. I served on the Council of Europe. I was Tony Blair's personal European envoy. And I remain absolutely fascinated by the idea of Europe, created, first set in motion in 1950 by Robert Schuman, and Schuman was a devout Catholic, and now the Vatican is proposing to make him a saint, which is quite extraordinary. Saint Robert de l'Europe. But to be a saint, you have to show that you have worked miracles. So I think we should all pray to the future Saint Robert Schuman now and ask for a miracle, which is to make the European Union happy and content and growing and properly collegial, instead of the rather problematic European Union we have today. That's enough from me, but yes, I'm fascinated by Europe, and I really look forward to all of you when you graduate and leave and go into different businesses, making a good success of Europe over the next 30, 40, 50 years. It's certainly, if I think of my own personal background, an Irish family on one side, a Polish family on another, though Ireland, Poland, many other countries that suffered terribly in the 20th century, the 19th century, the 18th century, but since 1950 and above all since 1990, have become whole and free and led much more complete lives than certainly was the case of many Europeans when I was your age.
Well, thank you very much for this quick presentation. You told us you were passionate about Europe, and that's what we want to start with, and particularly with the issue of Brexit. So back in 2018, you talked about a Brexit eternity. And you wrote this book, which is entitled Brexit, No Exit, Why Britain Won't Leave Europe in 2017. What is your point of view now that Brexit has been implemented?
I wrote a book. In fact, I'm very sorry, I meant to get it down to show you on the screen. I wrote a book in 2014 called Brexit, How Britain Will Leave Europe. That was my first intervention by way of books. I've written many books, but I've written 3 on Brexit. And I just looked at what the mood of Britain was and how any plebiscite here would become about immigration. I looked at France and the Netherlands in 2005, where there were referendums on the constitutional treaty, and the French and the Dutch were the first people to say no to Europe in a really big way this century. In fact, nearly all the countries which have held a referendum on Europe this century, I'm talking about since the year 2000, have voted no to a European treaty, a European project. So putting it to the British people, even if it was more dramatic in-out, it wasn't, they were told that you could vote no, but you'd stay in the single market. You could vote no, but you could continue to live and retire and work in Europe. You could vote no, but all the firms would stay in the city and trade would be normal. And you'd vote no, and £350 million a week would come to our health services. So, those were quite attractive. And yet the remarkable thing was that only 36%, 36% of the total British electorate voted for Brexit. In most countries, there's a constitutional bar. You want to change the constitution in a dramatic way, a referendum must have 50% of all the voters, or in Switzerland, 50% of all the voters and more than half of all the cantons. I think in Hungary, constitutional change demands 66% of all voters, and we let it all happen for 36%. So that's why then I never thought Britain would leave Europe as a whole, and we're still in Europe, we're still involved in Europe, which is the argument in the second book. And the final book, and I don't think I want to write any more books on Brexit, I can go insane writing books on Brexit, is that it's what I invented, a new word. I used the word Brexit first in 2012. New word is Brexiternity, l'éternité de Brexit, the Ewigkeit von Brexit, Brexiternity. We're living that now, and I look at my Financial Times, our main business paper today, huge, very large article on the immense damage to service firms. That's firms of professionals in the city, the financial sector, the banks, the professions, the agents comptables, the architects, and then the musicians and the people who organize concerts, and all of them suffering directly already, even with the pandemic suppressing a lot of negatives from Brexit, really, really worried. So this is just going to go on for year after year after year. And the big vote we had on Thursday in Scotland, where now a majority of the members of the Scottish Parliament want a referendum to leave the Union with England, is precisely because our Prime Minister did not respect the wishes of the Scottish people who voted 2-1 to stay in Europe. So Brexit is injecting itself into domestic politics in Britain in a very dramatic way, and will continue to do so for some time.
All right. And so do you feel like Brexit has weakened politics in the UK? And especially, you just talked about the potential independence of Scotland. Do you think that there could be a yes to this referendum in the times?
Well, I think so. I think that's possible. I mean, the opinion polls show 50-50. But what we find with referendums is people don't make up their minds on the basis of rational economic decision. They make up their minds on emotion. I'll never forget the big debate on television in 1992 between François Mitterrand and Philippe Séguin on the Maastricht Treaty. And in the end, Séguin is trying to make a rational case, and Mitterrand says, mais l'Europe est là pour nous protéger, to protect us. So he's offering this kind of assurance to the French people they'll be better protected by staying in Europe. And that's a powerful emotional appeal. And so again, in Scotland, the proponents of Scottish separation or independence say, look, we could be like Denmark. We could be like Norway. We could be like Sweden, the Netherlands, smaller countries that have got a balanced, sensible economy. We don't have to be dictated to by a narrow elite of English right-wing conservatives who have no interest in Scotland. That's emotional appeal. And I think if English nationalism, which now is a huge driving force in UK politics, you might call it Orbanism or Marine Le Penism. I don't know exactly the different AfD-ism in German context. If that's now driving English politics, well, the Scottish people may very well, I was born in Scotland, may very well say, sorry, no thanks.
Okay, Thank you very much. I assumed you've heard about the events, the recent events between fishermen in this island, like Jersey, Guernsey. So that's a thing, but I think it's a bit more complex. And do you think that it is possible to maintain a strong relationship with the UK, between the UK and Europe, the EU, after Brexit? And should European nations fight to maintain this strong bilateral relationship with the UK?
Very, very much so. You said, Valentin, that it's Jersey and Guernsey. It's not Guernsey. Guernsey's got no problem. And it's not even all Jersey fishermen, because the people who are also taking part in the protest were the fishermen of Jersey, who now find they can't land any of their coquille Saint-Jacques, or je sais pas, maquereau, I don't know what they catch, coquillage, where it's bought, namely on the port de pêche normande, the Normandy fishing ports. We don't eat so much shellfish, crustacés in England. And so it was a politically motivated man or men in the Jersey government who are very rich. They like their little paradis fiscal, tax haven. They're very close to the Tory party. They're, in British political terms, very, very, right wing. Not in a Marine Le Pen sense, but they're very anti-European. And they thought they caused some trouble. But I've been arguing since day one, touche pas à mon pote, touche pas à mon pêcheur. The impact, the kind of emotional impact of the fishing communities in France, from Boulogne to Saint-Juan-de-Luz, is enormous. It's quite big here too. And so this is a no benefit to British fishermen. This is just a very silly reaction. I think Mr. Johnson is embarrassed by it. I don't think France has been wise to threaten twice now, once from Madame Girardin last week and another minister today, to cut off electricity to hospitals or care homes. You just don't do that in any kind of state. The height of fights between Israelis and Arabs, the Arabs could have, but never threatened to cut off oil. That's not a weapon you use. It's very foolish of French ministers to do that. So I hope it will settle down, but it may spring up again on some other issue. There's so many relations have become much tenser, and like it or not, France is England's principal neighbor, separated by 30 kilometers, 25 kilometers of the Étoile de Douvres and the Channel. Always has been, all 1,000 years we've been selling first wool and then coal. Britain was the Saudi Arabia of Europe up to the end of the 19th century. I mean, our biggest export was coal, and a lot of it was going to France and other European countries. Now, it just requires a small, mistake, and an explosion can happen. It's very, very worrying.
Right, and talking about this, we're going to move on a little bit to the European subject more in depth, especially since you were appointed delegate for the Council of Europe in 2006. Could you explain to us how this body of international public law, so the Council of Europe, is really effective in maintaining democracy in Europe, and especially in a time when we see populist parties growing up, flourishing in Hungary and Italy and France? What do you think?
The Council of Europe is a wonderful body set up largely on the initiative of Winston Churchill, and it drew up the European Convention on Human Rights in the early 1950s and set up a court of human rights. If you think about it, if the objection is to supranational law that is more powerful than the law of a nation, can tell a country what to do, then the Council of Europe is very, very effective. In fact, decisions of the Council of Europe for example, on châtiment des enfants dans l'école. When I was at school, to learn your Latin subjunctive verbs, if you didn't get them right, you were taken out and you were beaten. Bang, 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 bang. This was thought how to get Latin subjunctive verbs and Greek philosophy into the heads of young English boys. Now that was made illegal during the conflicts in Northern Ireland to begin with. The British Army behaved like all armies do when they have to do a job of a policeman. They're too aggressive, they're too strong, they torture people, they put them under heavy interrogation, they put black hoods over their heads, things like that. That was made illegal. And so the British government's always obeyed Council of Europe decisions. It's expanded largely because at the end of communism, 1990 onwards, all the ex-communist states, including the Soviet Union, ex-Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, joined the Council of Europe, as did countries that were semi-dictate military countries like Turkey, as did the Stans, Azerbaijan, Georgia. I mean, I welcome them all, but the plain fact is that Mr. Putin is not going to take orders from the Council of Europe on how to create democracy in Russia. And unfortunately, that spirit of illiberal authoritarianism is spreading westward. So Mr. Orban isn't interested in obeying the rulings of the Council of Europe. Mr. Erdogan certainly isn't. Mr. Kaczynski also. And because the EU, in a sense, has subcontracted, it's given the obligation, the duty of trying to make Europe more democratic to the Council of Europe, it's not used the much greater powers it has. Because at the end of the day, the Council of Europe has no power of sanction. It did suspend or threaten to suspend Russia at the time of the invasion and annexation of Crimea, because Crimea was part of Ukraine and Ukraine was a Council of Europe member. So it said, hey, Council of Europe, this big powerful state has behaved like the Wilhelmine Reich in taking over Alsace-Lorraine. We want our Crimea back. So the Russian deputies walked out rather than, I think, face a formal suspension. But then 4 or 5 years later, because the Council of Europe needs a budget, it needs a money, and Russia is it's proportionate to your population. Russia is a big payer. They were let back in again. So it's there as a sanction, it's there as a debating forum. But if a country chooses to violate Council of Europe norms, like, for example, Mr. Putin is so clearly with Alexander Navalny, there's no question about it, like Mr. Orban is so clearly with creating a network of media outlets. He leaves Budapest alone, but in the rest of Hungary, then there's pretty much full-scale Orban state control of the media, like the Polish government insisting it can replace any judges it dislikes and nominate judges that will interpret the constitution, for example, in a way that suits the ruling party. So when the Council of Europe criticizes Mr. Orban, Mr. Kaczynski, they don't, they just delay it. They don't walk out. And there are now a lot of members of the Council of Europe, member states, they all send delegations to the Parliamentary Assembly where I served, but a lot of those delegations will come from countries whose governments are telling their representatives, you mustn't support this sanction on Orban, this sanction on Kaczynski, this sanction on Putin. So it's better, much better than nothing. And the European Court of Human Rights, which is independent, does take up key issues, but it's not the magic Harry Potter wand, the battle magique de Harry Potter, to impose democracy on the rest of Europe.
So do you think that giving the European Council like a punitive power would be a good or a bad thing for Europe, for the EU, for the good state of the European Union?
That's such a good question. Look, when I was a young journalist, there was a chap who was a man who was president of France. You may have heard of him, called General de Gaulle. And every morning at 8 o'clock, General de Gaulle had a meeting with his press team, his Alain Perfit and his heads of communication, and they decided what would be in the Journal Télévisé of 20h, what would be in the main French TV news program. This all happened, when your parents weren't even probably at university, and it was the norm. In Germany, I don't think there is any longer, but there was what's called a Berufsverbot. That is a prohibition to exercise a profession if you were in the Communist Party. So, I mean, imagine in France or in Italy, if in the last 60 years, every member of the PCF or the PC, the Communist parties of France and Italy, had been stopped from working in schools. I mean, in some places there wouldn't be many teachers, but in Germany it was the norm. And all the arguments with the German authorities saying from the Council of Europe, this is anti-democratic, that you stop someone teaching because of their political party affiliation, was just repudiated because of the German obvious obsession with ensuring the Nazis never came back to life, but also many people in Germany, especially on the right, did that equation of the Nazi party was the same as communists in democracies, and therefore we should ban the communists as well. So it's a process of education, but in the end, as with Mr. Berlusconi in Italy, who also controlled too much of the media, you have to organize politically to replace him and then relax media controls. I'm not sure it could be or return to a plurality of media ownership and platforms as in Italy. I don't think it can be decreed by a group of delegated members of parliament, deputies in Strasbourg. But it's there as a benchmark, and we certainly should support it and give the Council of Europe as much backing as possible.
Okay, thank you. So Europe is important, but it's not obviously the whole world. And you wrote a few years ago this book entitled Globalizing Hatred, the New Anti-Semitism, which explains that anti-Semitism hides a deeper problem that threatens the world peace. Do you feel like there will be a major conflict in a few years' time? And do you share the now quite controversial ideas of Samuel Huntington, who predicted the clash of civilizations back in 1996? And would you say that more generally the democracy is threatened nowadays?
Look, I think religion is a source of immense human conflict today. Hans Kung is a very famous Catholic theologian, a German theologian who died a month or two ago. He said there'll be no peace between nations until there's peace between religions. And if you look at some of the great conflicts of European history, they've been based around religion, and there now is a aspect of Islam, the ideology or ideological praxis and theory of an ideology called Islamism, which is not the same as Islam any more than General Franco represented all Catholics or Protestant people who insisted on burning Protestants, who insisted on killing Catholics, represented all Catholics. But so you've got great tension there. I think, I mean, Huntington was all, I think, overwriting a sort of white Christian Northern Euro-Atlantic perspective. But there are great conflicts at the moment. within Islam, between Shia and Sunni, Iran and all its enemies, great conflicts in India between the Hindu nationalist supremacy of Prime Minister Modi and the several hundred million Muslims who live in India. He's just annexed the Indian part of Kashmir, which is predominantly Muslim, and when Pakistan and India separated in 1948, Kashmir was meant to have a referendum on which country it would belong to, Muslim Pakistan or India, mainly Hindu India. But the Indians invaded and stopped that referendum from taking place. And so we've lived since 1948 with a divided Kashmir, part of it occupied by India, part of it occupied by Pakistan. But Mr. Modi's gone, that's the sort of status quo. But Mr. Modi's gone one step further. He's doing that in the name of Hindu supremacism. And I think if you look at too many countries, still religion is the source of too many conflicts. I don't see a world clash of civilization. Look at the way Mr. Putin, to assert his authority, has become ultra religious in terms of going to the the Russian Orthodox churches are being blessed by the patriarchs. So, heaven's sake, Putin grew up a traditional Russian atheist, but he knows, many Russian people still in their inner being believe in the verities of their church, so he identifies with the church. It's 200 years, more than 200 years since Voltaire said "écraser l'enfant," and we're still waiting for l'enfant to disappear.
Right, and so when you talked about all these conflicts in the world and in Europe, in European history, according to you, where do you see the future of Europe, like in maybe 10 years' time or 20 years' time?
I think people have decided very intelligently to bury the huge differences that up till 1945 existed in Europe. We talk about the 30 Years' War of the 17th century, but actually we had a 30 years European Civil War from 1914 to 1945. There wasn't a year where there were not quite serious conflicts somewhere in Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece. And so we just woke up, I think, thank God, very good leadership from some people at the time, and created this very bizarre, it's an unidentified flying object, this thing called the European Community, then the European Union. But it works. It allows countries to be strongly national. I'd say there's a printemps des nations with the European Union, in that many countries now have their cultural rights respected, their language respected. When I go to France, I think France is more French than ever. France hasn't sort of disappeared into marmite bruxellois, European Brussels melting pot. Countries like my father's country, he was a young new officer in 1939. He was wounded leading his men against a nationalist army from Germany. But Poland today is just transformed. I was there in the era of Solidarność. I wrote books of Solidarność. I was put in prison briefly by the Polish communists when I was taking money to the underground Solidarność Union. But Poland now is so much richer, more comfortable. I mean, yes, there's bad politics in my judgment, but the people are great. It's got lots of media. They can travel anywhere and everywhere. And this is fabulous. We're doing that from the north of Sweden to the smallest Greek island. We're doing that in the French dom-toms. We are should be clearing up areas like the Western Balkans, but still the point about Europe is that its decisions are taken by national governments. There are fewer officials, fonctionnaires of the European Union working in Brussels than there are for Madame Hidalgo in Paris. So this idea of some giant superstate that is crushing the life out of everybody is just nonsense. We've invented a lot of good common rules. And the most important one is, you go anywhere in Europe and you ask for a glass of water or a saucisson frite in any country, and you're pretty much guaranteed that water will be safe to drink, and the frite will have been cooked properly, and the saucisson, depending on which country you're in, will be nice, but at least it will be completely safe to eat. And so we've insisted everybody should have access to healthcare, to education, the forms of a free media, and these are incredible gains. Europe's never had 70 years, never, since the word was first invented in Greek antiquity, never had such a long period of peace. And I think that is a modern miracle. I mean, I wish in Latin America, where I worked as a minister, because I speak Spanish, I wish in Latin America they could have a Latin American union that would be similar. So yeah, we should have to work on it. Don't idealize it. Don't make it Saint Europe, Sancta Europa, but defend it, preserve it, and ensure that Europe sets a model then for the rest of the world. I mean, it really is. I think of my mother's and father's generations, you're all much younger than me. It is just literally unbelievable what's happened in the space of one or two people's lifetimes.
Still talking about Europe and the relationship between the different countries, maybe a more economics question. We saw that the COVID crisis has had a huge impact, and sometimes it was different from countries to countries. So in your opinion, who are the losers and winners of this crisis, and how could it be possible to restore some more equality between the European countries for the future years?
I think the pandemic has been a wake-up call. I don't think they're winners or losers. If the definition is which prime minister has presided over the biggest number of deaths, unfortunately, it's here in Britain with Mr. Johnson. If the definition is which prime minister has got a health service and has vaccinated the maximum number of people, it's also here in the UK. And what we've seen, haven't we, in Europe is once again how it has been national government decisions that have decided how to handle the pandemic, how long to have lockdown, confinement, what orders to give to citizens, attestation, all the rest of it, whether to close down frontiers, whether to let people travel. But I think that it's been good that the EU has tried to share vaccine production. I think it's been too slow, but don't forget, there are many so-called competencies, what the state does, that are reserved exclusively for the state. For example, the European Union cannot send anybody to fight and die for Europe. Envoyer un citoyen mourir pour la patrie dans l'armée, that is something that belongs to a sovereign state. Europe doesn't decide our taxes. That is something. Take away a man's life, take away a man's money, or woman, forgive me, take away a citizen's liberty, in other words, decide the crimes that put the citizen in prison. Those belong, for the time being, to the supreme authority of the state. And health is one of those. So whereas you might think logically, somebody in Brussels could have immediately phoned up Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Sanofi and other Moderna and say, right, you drop everything. Here is all the money you need. You throw everything at vaccine development and we'll share it out pro rata according to the population. But no, the states couldn't agree on that common policy. In Britain, all the decisions about the vaccines were taken while Britain was still 100% under the rule and following the laws of the European Union. So having voted Brexit 5 years ago did not help produce one single dose. I mean, that was thanks to the British National Health Service, which is a state-funded, not-for-profit, giant health service. It's not like the police d'assurance mutuelles that you have elsewhere in Europe. So they had enough men, experience, resources to like landing in Jourdain on the beaches of Normandy. Other countries a bit slower, but they're catching up fast. I mean, Germany is vaccinating 700, 800,000 people a day, France 400, 500,000 a day. So I hope by Ascension, middle of August, maybe even the end of July, most of Europe will be vaccinated. And then there'll be some very big questions to be decided about what is the economic feuille de route, I mean, roadmap out of the pandemic economic crisis into a recovery mode. And there'll be some very interesting decisions taken, not the least in my own country.
Right, thank you very much. Just before moving on to the questions of the public, we had a question about more focused on the UK, especially about the political system and the fact that you were a former member of the House of Commons makes a link with the fact that the other house, the House of Lords, welcomes members that are not elected but heirs. And we were wondering, what do you think of the English monarchy? And would you say that the system is outdated, or is it still efficient, or the best solution for the UK and the Commonwealth today?
The founder of modern India, Mahatma Gandhi, who was educated as a lawyer in London, somebody once asked him, Mahatma, what do you think of British civilization? And his reply was, that would be a good idea. So I don't really think we're as well governed as we should. Separate the House of Lords from the monarchy. The House of Lords is not it's a scandal. I mean, there are only about, I know, 50% of them now consist of men who inherited their title of Duke or Lord or Marquis from their fathers. But too many of the other ones simply signed a check, made a donation to the Conservative Party or gave a lot of money to the Labour Party or Liberal Democrat Party and were given a reward to be a legislator. I mean, I just find that almost unbelievable. It's like, I mean, there are always accusations about party financing and one or two politicians getting rich in all countries, and not the least France. But I don't think anybody says, voilà, Monsieur Macron, Monsieur Hollande, or Monsieur Sarkozy, I will give you a check for 10 million euros, and in exchange, you'll make me a senator or a lawmaker or a deputy. So that definitely needs reform. Royal family itself is too big. It's a sensitive subject now. The Queen is 95 years old. She's in, well, we don't know. I mean, her mother died, I think, aged 100. And one wishes her, a continuing good life. Her husband, Prince Philip, as you know, died a month short of being 100 years old when he was 99 a few weeks ago. But her big worry is, does she die as Queen of the United Kingdom or simply as Queen of England? If Scotland decides to separate, maybe the British citizens in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, may decide to go in an independent way. And Wales now, the little country of Wales, which has never had a strong independentist movement, now has got one. So I mean, I have to say, by nature, I'm a Republican. But when I look at Europe, a lot of countries that seem to have monarchs, Sweden, Norway, Netherlands, Denmark, that aren't so bad, and a lot of proud republics like Italy or Slovakia, or well, you choose them, where there seems to be an awful lot of corruption and bad behavior. So maybe having a fully constitutional, but I'd say a much more modest monarch. I don't know if everybody in France is watching The Crown. I recommend it because it's almost like a documentary. I mean, I believe me, it's made as a very, very nice feuilleton TV show, but phew, the politics of it and the tensions over the 1950s and 60s and 70s right up until maybe the time of the death of Princess Diana, those were real. I mean, those were absolutely accurately represented there. So yeah, it's part of the charm of Europe. It's not got a single model of governance. It elects some crazy prime ministers and presidents at times, but then gets rid of them in due course. And it is curious that other than Britain, most of the European countries that have a monarch, I would say, are much better Republican and ethically and morally based systems of state administration than many of the proud republics of Europe. There's a question for you to think about.
Okay, go ahead, Manon.
Okay, thank you very much. We are now going to move on to the questions of the public, so we will read them out loud.
I have it. I have it. Is Brexit a failure? Voilà, Bertine Marchand. Is Brexit a failure of previous British governments, including those of which you were a member? Yes. Yes, yes, yes. In the end, the decision to hold a referendum on whether to stay or leave Europe was the responsibility of one man, an elite, rich prime minister, unbelievably arrogant, called David Cameron. I mean, a nice man. He wasn't arrogant in his personal behavior, but he made an historic mistake, which I'm sure he now regrets. But well before that, we never explained Europe adequately. When I was a minister, right now the government is spending maybe £100 million on doing lots of television advertising, social media advertising about Brexit, normally to explain, get ready for Brexit. That's okay. I mean, governments have to spend money on what's called public information. I mean, it's a duty of the state. My budget to explain Europe when I was the minister to all the British people was cut to £150,000, 200,000 francs. That is the price to launch a shoelace of a new basket being launched by Nike or one of the sports shoes manufacturers. It was ridiculous. And I came back on a plane once with Tony Blair, and I don't know where we'd been, Warsaw or Madrid, somewhere. And I said, Tony, that was a really good speech you made about Europe. It was visionary. It was, people loved it, saying how important Europe was. Could you make one of those speeches ever in our country, Tony, in England, in English? And he sort of laughed at me and said, come on, Denis, what can I do with the tabloids that I have? But I think that was a failure of Blair and all British governments in the last 40 years, or maybe the last 30 years, to actually make some of a case for Europe. I mean, all politics is about education, education, education. You have to go out and tell people this is what's happening, this is what I am proposing, this is what we should do, and try and create at least enough support. No, not 100% support, but enough support. We never ever did that on Europe at all. And certainly this century, the Conservative Party found it was very payant to be anti-European. I mean, if you know your French history, Jacques Chirac with the so-called appel de, what was it called? 1978. He made a big speech saying Europe was an American project, France must resist it, Europe was bad for us. So he changed. But for the last 20 years, the British Conservatives, the British right, have been consistently anti-European, and ministers have not challenged them, not taken them on. So yes, I think a big responsibility lies with the Labour government, which, you know, where I was associated with it for many years. Probably all the governments since Mrs. Thatcher left in 1990 have just given up explaining Europe in an intelligent, rational way.
All right, thank you. So we have another question here. In the long term, is Britain bound to reintegrate Europe to exist on the world stage, according to you?
Again, fascinating question. Certainly not in the short term. And it's difficult, you know, when you get divorced, or if you move your house or your apartment, maybe a year or 2 years later, you say, oh my God, why on earth did I get divorced? Yeah, okay, there were problems, but it was happy, it was comfortable. Why have I left my old apartment, my old house to live in this new one with big windows and everything made out of metal? Ugh, it's horrible, but you can't go back. And so getting back fully into the EU as a member, I don't say it can't happen. I just don't see the schema, the way it might happen right now. That said, I think we can, over time, come to a more intelligent relationship with the EU, a bit as the Swiss have done, a bit as the Norwegians have done. It's difficult to sketch it out now, probably not until the Boris Johnson government is over, because he regards leaving Europe as his supreme religious achievement. A lot depends also on you, on everybody in continental Europe, in the European Union, you, the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Italians, the Poles, the Bulgarians. If you can show the world and show the Brits that Europe is a success, Europe is growing. You know, it doesn't have to be insane growth, but 2.5–3% a year. You have 2.5–3% growth a year. In 10 years, you've increased your personal wealth, national wealth, European wealth by 50%. It's the magic of compound interest. You show that you can handle the illiberal authoritarians. You show that you can integrate the Western Balkan countries. You show that Europe can speak with one voice vis-a-vis Putin, maybe Erdogan, maybe China. Then that will start to impress the Brits. I mean, the British fell in love with the idea of Europe. They didn't join in the 1950s, but then they saw that France, Germany were growing twice as fast as Britain. The economic developments of those countries were so much stronger. And so the ruling elites in Britain in the 1960s decided we better join. We can't afford to be left out. Unfortunately, Europe, roughly I'd say since the introduction of the euro as a real currency, you know, the last 20 or so years, has been too slow growth, too many internal difficulties, too much inability to reform, to restructure itself, too much poverty, too much wealth on one hand and very, very poor conditions, especially for older people on the other hand, and not found an equilibrium. But if Europe can find its way to growth, to social justice, to dealing with the climate change issues, some, not all, some foreign affairs problems, then, you know, the British are realistic. They will see maybe this is something again that we should be part of.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question in the chat. So yeah, this time it's again about monarchy. In a recent survey published by YouGov, only 25% of respondents said the UK should have an elected head of state instead of the Queen. So how do you explain this popularity among the people, even though it may not have been the case since Queen Elizabeth became Queen?
I rather think if you had the same question for the Norwegian monarch or the Swedish monarch, maybe the Dutch, Danish, I don't know, the result would be not so dissimilar. In the question of the Queen, I mean, she really is now the mother of the nation. She's the last person, almost, who wore the uniform of the British Army in the Second World War. She was a trainee mechanic on cars, but she was in the women's part of the army. And so she now is just up there as almost with semi-divine status. I think, and as I say, I wish her as long and happy a life as God will give her. But when she does die, the next one will be much more problematic, and the one after that, and the one after that. But right now, if I take you all out into the street and say, here are 50 microphones, ask the British people, would you like to see a politician become your head of state? They'd all go, no, thank you. That I think is why that YouGov poll result was what it was.
All right. There's another question on Brexit again. Will Brexit initiate a domino effect on countries following in the footsteps of the UK, or does the EU stand stronger than ever after Brexit?
Very interesting question. When Brexit happened, Marine Le Pen put the British Union flag, the famous Union Jag, on her Facebook and Twitter handle and said, bravo l'Angleterre. But quite quickly, she took them down because she saw, as everybody did, that all Brexit did was instantly cut economic growth, but above all, it just created a political crisis, and we're still working through that political crisis. I know Mr. Johnson's become the Prime Minister, but there's no political stability here in Britain. We had election partielle municipale in Scotland on Thursday, which still today the BBC are saying the country's divided, the political parties are divided. So I think it was a wake-up call. It was very interesting how Madame Le Pen very fast dropped the idea of leaving the EU, even dropped the idea of a referendum on the euro, the euro. In Germany as well, the Alternative for Deutschland, which was very, very hostile to the euro and called for a return to the Deutschmark, that collapsed. In Greece, you had crazy guys like Yanis Varoufakis, who claimed to be on the left, but actually is just a nationalist populist. But the Greek people were given a chance for a referendum to leave the euro, and they said no. Our savings are in the euro, our pay is in the euro. Of course, we're not going to leave this good currency from the Greek point of view. So you've got poorer countries in the West Balkans, like North Macedonia, Kosovo, Albania, were very keen to join the European Union. Georgia, Ukraine would like to be closer to the European Union. So no, I think it's still Brexit. Again, if in 20 years' time, everybody in this country is driving around in a Porsche, we're all living in houses with another house in the countryside, we're all paid a massive amount of money, there's no poverty, all our children are being very well educated, we don't have to wait 2 years for a operation on for your Orange for your hips, then yeah, we'll think Brexit was a success. But literally every day, if you read at least the serious paper, the Financial Times, there's a negative story about Brexit. So I don't think Britain's going to fall in love with Brexit, and I don't think anybody in Europe thinks Brexit is a model to be followed.
Right, last question before I think it's time to end this conference. Acknowledging that Scotland voted 62% to 38% in favor of remain in the EU referendum, do you think that this would justify a second vote on independence?
It's certainly one of the pushes for it. Also handled, I'd say, in a not very clever way by the Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson, who always sounds like a Southern elite English nationalist when he's talking to Scotland. He could not, there were big elections for the Scottish Parliament on last Thursday after 6 weeks of quite strong campaigning. And Mr. Johnson, who's leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, could not show his face. He couldn't go there. It would be like Macron, French president, unable to go to PACA or Nord-Pas-de-Calais or the Vendée. He's so unpopular because the Scots feel they voted to keep their rights to travel in Europe, work in Europe, live in Europe, retire in Europe. A clear majority, 2-1 in the Brexit referendum. But then suddenly the Southern English nationalists interpreted Brexit in a very, very hard way that completely rejected the point of view or indeed the votes in Scotland. And they've voted now twice for their Scottish Parliament, and each time they've elected a majority of Scottish Parliament deputies who are in favour of Europe. So it's a standoff, you know. It's a contradiction, and it certainly, as I said earlier, it is one of the push factors in favour of a new referendum. What the outcome of that referendum would be, I'm not sure. The Scottish nationalist leader, Mrs. Sturgeon, must, I think, always have in the back of her mind what happened in Quebec. Quebec voted once in a referendum and said no to leaving Canada. And then the Quebec separatists organized another referendum 20 years later, 1995. And this time they also voted no. And then it was dead forever. So you can lose one referendum on independence or secession or separation, but if you lose two, your cause is finished. So it just means that constitutional question will be a big factor, maybe dominate a bit the whole of British politics for the rest of this parliament. We think the next election will be in 2023. We're not sure. It's flexible under English law. So rest of this year, next year, 2023, we'll be debating Scottish independence and constitutional questions in Britain in a huge way, in a very big way.
All right, thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of this conference. Thank you very much, Mr. MacShane, for your time, for your answers. Maybe you can stay with us a little bit at the end in a breakout room. And for all of you online, thanks for joining. We really hope to see you again tonight at 5 p.m. for another conference, and tomorrow as well for the second day of the European Week. Have a great evening.
Merci. Thank you, Manon.